Good evening. My name is Kim Sawchuk, and I am from Concordia University in Montreal, and I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to thank the sponsors of this event tonight, the Propeller Project, Incubator Lab, and I'd like to thank the University of Windsor and for having me here. And I'm really sorry Jennifer Willett, one of my former students, is not here, but she's got other things happening in life right now, and we wish her well and are thinking about her. I'd also like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The University of Windsor sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and we thank them for their generosity in having us here tonight and letting us share in this territory. So this is conceived of as a roundtable event. And really, we're not a big audience or not a big group. We're here to have a discussion. So I'm going to turn things a little bit on its head immediately. In the spirit of research creation, I'm going to first introduce the people who are here, and I'll have them say their names. You may know each other. But then what I'm going to ask is for each of you to say who you are so we know who you are. And maybe we can have not have just like a proscenium thing going where we're the people talking and you're the people listening. The idea is to kind of get a conversation going. So start here. I've said who I am.
Hello, I'm Mike Dara. I teach here in the School of Creative Arts. I teach primarily media art history courses. I'm also an associate dean in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And within the context of research creation, I'm a co-founder of a group here called Interminus, which has been trying to think about connections between research creation and urban cultures for the last 10 years.
I'm Kim Nelson, and I'm a professor and a filmmaker here at the University of Windsor, and I'm a member of Propeller. And my creative practice is very research creation-y because, I guess I'll get into it, but I do live documentaries, and so that's what I'll be talking about today.
I like creation-y.
Yeah.
I'm Ziggy Turinos, and I teach time-based media and integrated media, so that covers a few things, and with Brent working on Noise Water project, which we mainly do here, and we have a performance coming up on the 2nd of March in the evening, and the research is about the relationship image and sound to make it really general.
And I'm Brent Lee. I'm also a professor in the School of Creative Arts, and like Mike, also an associate dean in the Faculty of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. I'm a composer and a musician and sometimes media artist, and I've collaborated, I think, with everybody here except Kim. Maybe that's coming up someday.
You never know. That's what these things are about.
It seems my creative work has largely in the last 10 years become very collaborative with artists and filmmakers and people working different media.
Great. So really what I want to do here is that I've asked for just 4 simple questions, and this is a bit of an experiment. It sort of started in my institution, I guess, in January or so, and I don't know why, but I just thought we were at a different moment in terms of research creation practices, in terms of our history. And students still have a lot of anxiety, but also a kind of need continually to discuss and reflect about the relationship that people have as artists and creators in relationship to what it means to be doing this kind of work in the academy, in a kind of a context where there's certain kinds of demands that are placed on people who have different forms of creative practice. And so in January, I think it was January, some kind of time is moving in funny ways right now, I decided to start a roundtable, and this is another format of it, where 4 people from my institution who have different kinds of research creation practices, Mia Consalvo, who does game design, Darren Werschler, who's both a really well-known poet but also does work on games and technology, Aaron Manning, who's an artist and a philosopher and a writer, and me, I moderated. And the idea is that I get invited to come to universities and do things, and it's really nice to talk, but I really want to find out who people are when I go there. And I also want to kind of continue to have these conversations about not what research creation is. My intention is never to police these things, but to find out what people are doing and how people's ideas around it or their practices have evolved through time. but also to see whether or not there's ways that through a conversational format, we can also kind of, in the spirit of, I think, research creation, invent new methodologies to have discussions with each other about what it is we do and what we also want to do and what we could imagine doing if we had all the time, money, effort, and facilities in the world, perhaps. And so this is also meant to be something that if you want to hold a research creation conversation, I invite you to set one up anytime, anywhere, play around with the format. It's meant to also, I think what I'd like to propose to the University of Windsor and all of the fine people here is that we kind of tape these things. I taped the first one on my iPhone. It was kind of spontaneous. The quality is really not very good, but we did a transcript, which I'd like to transcribe and then maybe set up a site somewhere where we could just sort of invite, sort of think about like how can we kind of create like a spore, like a mushroom spore, a kind of movement of people who try and think about how we kind of talk together about ideas that matter to us. And again, it's to see what the practices are. Because as someone who, you know, both teaches and is involved in community-based work, I would never claim to be an artist. If you saw my art, you would laugh. But I work in collaboration with many artists. I still have an investment in also thinking about the ways the university can incorporate different kinds of practices, different kinds of research, not just outputs, different kinds of modalities of thinking through making, through kind of creative engagements. And also thinking about these kind of ways that art is not just out there, but that artistic kind of potential is, I think, embedded in a kind of experimental spirit that in the best philosophy and in the best social theory and in the best kind of ways of thinking is extraordinarily creative in and of itself. And what can we learn about reflecting on this? So this is meant to be a conversation. So really, what this is structured around is 4 really simple questions. And then after each 4 questions, I'm going to open it up to you to talk and ask. So rather than having a thing where we go blah, 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 blah at the front here, the idea is let's see if we can actually involve you if you so choose. You're not obliged to ask a question. You're not obliged to talk. But just anything you want to contribute, ask, or worry you have, personal or otherwise, feel free. So I'm just going to start. And again, it's not about policing the definitions of research creation. I want to explore people's practice. So I will start with you, Michael. Okay. Can you talk about your research creation practice?
Yeah, I mean, the practice that I've engaged with started really with my own historical research, coming out of my PhD project some 12, 13 years ago. Is that possible, Kim?
It is possible.
And that practice, I mean, I was interested in the history of media studies, the history of communication studies. Where did these fields come from in the 1940s and 50s? And so I started looking back at what some of the first questions that people were asking were back at that time, and realized that there's an immensely rich artistic history to how a lot of media thought evolved, especially in the Canadian context. Mm-hmm. And the first practitioners around, figures that you'd know, some people like Marshall McLuhan, for example, reached out immediately to other fields, including visual arts, including architecture, including anthropology and archaeology, and so on, and areas that had already established fields of what we would now call experiential learning, right? Engagement from field practice, going out into the field to do the work they do, using technologies to think about how do we document culture, right? And the fields like anthropology had a long history already of using photography and other mechanisms, film, right, to think about that, sometimes in very troubling ways, particularly in documenting indigenous cultures, for example. And so we started thinking about that. And another avenue that those researchers took was to look at architecture and urban planning, and to think about how to use technologies to document the changing context of the city. And so that was a real inspiration for me in terms of bringing students together, particularly graduate students, but also undergraduate students, as a part of a team to explore the history of a city, and then to think about how can we engage with that history in a productive way and create site-specific installation kind of work or other kinds of walking tours that allow us to engage with those particular histories. So that's where a lot of my work comes from.
Okay.
And for me, so I make documentaries and just traditional feature-length documentaries. And it was from sitting in the audience of Siggy and Brent's noise border practice. So they can describe better than me what they do. But I would go to their shows, and they have these beautiful visuals and really experimental music mixed in the room, and then afterwards, people would mingle. But I was really wanting to talk about the work with everyone, and I also thought, wouldn't it be really cool to have a documentary as part of this? So I was thinking about this, and I did happen upon a filmmaker that does a live documentary practice, but it's not this avant-garde interactive thing. That was what I was thinking of, and so that's what I wanted to do, and Brent is a part of that team and brings all his knowledge of multimedia programming and composing. So that was sort of the inspiration, and my goal is it's kind of like democratizing film. So I feel like now with social media, people are talking at each other. I really never understood what performing the self was until social media, and I thought that is performing the self. You're curating yourself and putting your best self out there, which I think can be really toxic. So it's creating a space where people come together face to face, and part of the idea too is using the software that Siggy and Brent are using. We can live mix the films in the room, so we present the documentary live. It's about a topic, and then we open it up to the audience. They can ask whatever they want. It was really funny. Before we ever performed it, several people said, "Oh, you better plant people in the audience to ask certain questions, because what if no one speaks? And what if somebody asks a terrible question?" And I just thought, no, I'm such a purist. I don't want to interact with cell phones in the audience, and I do not plant questions in the audience. And so far, it's been good. I was also worried about somebody getting the mic and talking for 20 minutes. That hasn't happened. And people will ask further questions, and they tend to keep asking questions along the same line because they think that's what they should do. You always get people pushing back, and that's what we wanted. So we're live mixing films, we're responding into a microphone, and it just goes where it goes. So that to me is research creation, and that's what I do.
That's your practice.
Yeah.
Great. Siggy.
So I do different things, and I thought the project I could talk about that's probably the most related is Browsing Beauty, because that came out of a time where I was interested in a topic which was, when does beauty happen, where it was really suspect, highly suspicious even, so it was kind of taboo, like you didn't talk about it. And so for me as an art student, that was really confusing, and so I thought the best way, and then of course there was no writing at that time about it, and the only writing that you could access was from a different century. And so I thought the best would be to work in collaboration with someone. So my friend Andrea Zunder-Platzmann in Germany, she had the same questions, and so we started a project which basically ask questions, but the answers come and the new questions come in the process of the making. So we decided the best way would be to make it collaborative, to work with different groups. And they've changed over time. Like the first was a group of mathematicians. So we asked them, when does beauty happen for you? And they would talk about the perfect shape of a parabola or something that is totally different for them than it would be for instance, we worked with a group of kindergarten kids. We asked them those questions, and they would say, my mom, or their favorite sausage. This was, it's just hilarious. And so for me, the interesting thing is to always work with different groups, but the knowledge actually comes together from these different groups. And it's building a database, and every time it gets more complex. Sometimes there's a simpler version, but in Brazil last year was with a group of art students, so that was quite different. And in Moscow was a group of conceptual artists, and very conceptual, very abstract. So they would say black, white, as an example, like what is the most beautiful thing for them. And it was all very abstract and very conceptual. So it's, for me, the totality of it all is where the creation of knowledge is, and it's like a dialectic process. So each time it happens, you already are in the process of creating the next question. So there's never, the way I see it, there's never like the final answer. It's each project creates the next project.
Beautiful.
research creation is kind of a funny thing for me. I've kind of floated into it over time. I always considered myself someone who created work that was kind of inquiry driven, where I'd have something I was trying to learn by doing the pieces I was making. Of course, working in music, a lot of it was very abstract. So there's not a specific subject matter. There's not necessarily a research question, but I would still, gather information that would find its way into a piece, sort of research before the piece would be made, whatever it was about instruments or ensembles or certain ideas about harmony or whatever it was, but more abstract things. And then a very intuitive process of making pieces, and then followed by a reflective process, sort of post factum, to sort of try and understand what I'd learned through it. And this sort of very much a stage-based sort of creative process. I guess it's a research. And some types of research creation are in that. Guided a lot of my work for a couple of decades. But starting, I guess, working with Noise Border in I guess 2008 is when we started. We started thinking about how these processes, the kind of the questions, could inform the creative work, and trying to embed methods and strategies and processes and techniques that are drawn from research and drawn from sort of creative making into a more inevitably complicated process, but possibly informing one, informing the other. And it got all very tangled up. As we're still untangling several years worth of work. But
the interesting thing is we started switching, like your language was music and my language was visual. And then you start doing visual things, and I'm learning sound from you, and that's where it gets tangled.
This is what happens. Like, was it 12 years later? Now I'm making video pieces, and Siggy's composing sound pieces. So, but it's the ideas get floated around. So I guess right now, what I'm interested in terms of what research creation is and how I sort of think about my own practice is thinking about how those two, the research side and the creative side, can be structured or related or informed by each other. In a way to make the work better, for one, that way that I can solve problems more easily, but also in a way that would translate practitioner knowledge into something that could be shared among practitioners or shared with students or shared with scholars, that, not just through listening to something, but also through reflecting on it and actually making those reflections, publicly available as a very low-level form of a research output, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so I turn it to you. Are there any questions or comments or just things
and Adam has a mic if anyone wants.
What is, and this, I don't mean to derail,
No.
What is the Propeller project, and what is Noise Border, those two things?
Good questions, because I was going to ask the question about Noise Border and Propeller. I don't know either.
Why don't you do Propeller?
So Propeller is a collaborative research creation group. So it's a group of visual artists, filmmakers, historians, scholars who do research creation, and we sort of get together and to bring in top people in this area and just try to support each other's work and just work in this area. And there's a lot of people working in research creation. It's quite sexy, and Kim Sawchuk is the author of my co-author of my favorite essay about it. And it was one that we circulated amongst the Propeller group right when we formed. So that's what Propeller is, just anything to do with research creation we're interested in. Yes, it's all university ones.
And it's fairly new.
Yeah. Yes, it's brand new, really.
So Noise Border is, I guess it's evolved over time. It's a project. There are many aspects to it. The space that we're in is partly Noise Border space that we created with some funding years ago, CFI funding. But it's a group of artists working in different media. It started like a music ensemble, I think, was what our original idea was. But with visual artists also part of the ensemble. So it was like a band, but we had artists also in the band doing visual design for the performances. And creating multimedia pieces. So all the pieces that we've made about, I would guess, 30 now over the year. Mostly performance pieces, but also installations and audience interactive things and so on. And they always have a visual element. They always have a live musician element. And there's always usually some sort of level of interaction, although sometimes it's more conceptual, the relationship between sound and image. But there tends to be a fairly high-tech component to a lot of what we do as well.
And the research part is to really find ways the two, sound and image, can interact in a way that it's not one decorating the other one, but that there's that they're equal, and you know, sometimes one takes over and sometimes the other one, but how they can talk to each other in a way that a third entity gets created.
Any other questions? Yes.
As an artist who, I know my work is research oriented, but how do we know as artists when we're really doing research? And I think the question sounds a little bit hazy or nebulous, but to frame the question, I'm someone who is going from many years, a couple of decades of getting grants for creation, and suddenly transitioning into a university position where I'm now applying for shirks that are research. In many ways, I'm still doing the same work. So I'm interested in this question of when as artists are we researching, and how are research and art intertwined in the university community.
Okay. Does anyone want to tackle that?
It's a question that interests me a lot, Catherine. Actually, you know, I'm of the four of us here. I'm the only one who's probably not trained officially as a maker of some sort. So I'm more in history and literature, and history of theater was part of my background. But I mean, thinking about SSHRC, and for those of you who don't know what SSHRC is, it's the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada that funds a lot of work in our areas. You know, the term research creation was put in place, in fact, really to validate artists and artistic work of different sorts as a basis for research funding, right? And because I think a lot of people felt left out of that kind of world of research funding before. But then we're in a period now where a lot of people in other fields realize that they're also doing creative work in some way. They're hesitant to call themselves artists, as am I. But they've done some kind of curative work, or they've been involved with other kinds of making, and so there's a creep, you know, where research creation has gone way beyond fields that define themselves as fine arts or making fields of sorts. So it's a very interesting and complex dynamic, because and one that I think, and this probably gets to some of your other questions, Kim,
Yeah.
but one that students grapple with. You know, I mean, our art students. I find my students who come from visual arts backgrounds are very hesitant to go to a place where their work as artists is validated as research. So it's something we can take up, I think, more.
I think that Kim's essay is super helpful in this. So she has frames for different kinds. So, and I always try to tick as many boxes as I can. I feel like what I'm doing ticks 3 boxes. I can't totally answer your question because I'm being somewhat conservative and traditional in how I interpret research. But in the essay, and stop me if I get this wrong, so it's defined as research for creation. And what I do is I do history documentaries live. So history, of course, there's research and there's creation. I mean, as of the philosophical boom in history and historiography in the early 20th century, we understand that history is a kind of literature, and of course it's based on research, but it's research creation right there. And then creative presentations of research is also something I'm really resonates for me with my work, because we're trying to do something really different and something that's discrete. Like every single performance is impacted by the people in the room, and no 2 performances are the same. And that we're inviting audiences to push back and comment on what we've presented. So it's a creative presentation of research. And then I'm going to try to get more into research from creation in the current project that we're working on, that we've got funding for right now. We're going to start doing surveys and talking to people afterwards and try to get from them what they think about it. And I know that people don't really tell you what they say is always a little different from the real reality, but I want to gather some research in that way. So these are traditional ideas of what research is. And the last one is creation as research. I think for you with your work, you're using a lot of data, and there's a lot of traditional kind of research involved in what you're pulling into your art. But the whole creation as research thing, that's one that I am like in the deep end on, and maybe some other people could explain that, but I bet your work is doing that too.
So one of the reasons I'm in the group is I'm trying to wrap my head around it. And to answer your question, I think it's, when you think research, you always think it's before or it's after something, an event. And the event is the art production. And I think what's challenging is really to see it actually happening in the moment. So it's, so that what I wrote down just before we got together was, I'm trying to still wrap my head around it, but it's not to think about something that has passed. I mean, that's over. Like, I finished this body of work, now let me think about it. And also not to, that it's way in the future, but it's rather in the moment. Like, in the moment of production is where the thinking is happening. Mm-hmm. So, and that gets misunderstood a lot. Like, when I'm called a maker, it's like I don't think, right? I'm just making. But in the making, that's where the thinking is happening.
I think that was exactly what we were trying to get at. And the fourth one, creation as a kind of research practice in and of itself is the hardest one, and the one we articulate the worst in that piece. Mm-hmm. But it's also because we didn't really know what we were doing when we wrote it. We were trying to figure out and make sense of our own histories and practices. And I will say, I don't say I'm an artist, but I have done a lot of community radio work, for example, and we would do a lot of really crazy experiments on radio and drag academics into studios and find ways to get them involved, loosen up a bit, and also bring artists in too, to really work with the radio genre as a kind of a format. And it taught me a lot about the kind of creative potential of both language and oral communication, but also the specificity of the medium. And another thing, as an artist too, I would sort of challenge is, like we have, there's histories of artistic production that are related to one's own work. So there's histories through conceptual art, or you talk about multimedia. So like, what are the inheritances? Is it fluxus? Mm-hmm. So even through thinking about kind of research, it's not just thinking about, well, what are the research concepts through high theory, I have to read Deleuze suddenly and blah, blah, that are going to inform my work, but also what are the histories that draw and inspire me when I'm kind of thinking about what it is that I'm going to be doing. And also, I totally agree with Ziggy, and it's the same thing even as a writer. It's like there's a great essay by this woman named Laurel Richardson called Writing as a Method of Inquiry, and it's so, for me, true, is that it will make a difference. I'm going to be really Innocent for a minute. You'll be happy. Like, I can't, if I'm trying to use a nail to write a postcard or a letter to someone and I have it with a rock, very different ideas and thoughts come out than if I'm using my pen, and I still revert to pen and paper, and I just find different ideas come out because of the texture and the materiality of this thing and the kind of memory that flows through my hand. And it's very different than when I'm typing on a computer. Or I'll use, if I'm really stuck, I'll pretend I'm writing a letter to my grandmother, who I was very close to, who was not an academic and who's long since deceased, but she's in my head. And so, in the writing, ideas emerge that would not have happened if I just sat and thought about them. And so I think we're trying to get to that moment of creativity that comes when you commit to working through whatever your own practice is. That's ineffable, hard to explain, but it's embodied, and it's memory, and it's related to all the things that you've read and looked at that just in that moment crystallize through in that moment of whatever form it takes. So I think that's what we were also trying to understand too, but also I think we also value the kind of knowledges that come through whatever the specificity of your own practice might be. Whether in my case, if it was going to be radio, there's specific people who've done radio art, for example, who've also been influential. And so again, I think creating those conversations is also likewise important. So I think when we were talking about research, we weren't just thinking about research for something. Again, I visited Michael's studio today, and he's doing a lot of work in environmentalism. I need to talk to environmental scientists. That will inform the work. It might not be put in the work in a way that is entirely visible, but it ends up sort of like a really good stew, melting together and melding and making something else that if you hadn't put all those ingredients together, it wouldn't be what it becomes. Jackie.
So thinking about your question, Catherine, about 6 years ago, I approached Kim with the same question. Kim was on my doctoral committee, and I was at Concordia as a research creationist artist in humanities. And I was getting into the time of, I finished my coursework and it was now dissertation time. And I was adamant that I was not going to write about my work in my dissertation because I didn't want to write an artist statement and I didn't want to feel like I was reducing my work, and I didn't want it to be autobiographical. There were so many hesitancies. And so I remember where we were sitting exactly. You were sitting across the table from me. We were at the Loyola campus. Yeah. And you looked at me and said, Jacqueline, it's not about, the challenge is not to write about your work, it is to write through your work. And now I'm not saying that I have fully understood what that means, and I think it's life's work, and that's good. But it occurred to me the linguistic switch that I needed to make in my thinking. And I did go on to finish, write a 4th chapter, and tried the through versus the about, and I keep revisiting it, but somehow that physical shift in 2 words started to make sense a little bit. So I do credit Kim with that. Thank you.
Okay, I think I want to move on to, because I know that we're also people who have different practices, but I think a lot of what for me has happened over the years through my encounters with students like Jackie and others is they're also pushing the parameters and the boundaries of what research creation will be in the future. So again, I'm total, as a prof, I'm always kind of aware that I don't want to be here sort of just establishing kind of like a border for people. And I also find the work that my students are doing always super inspirational and testing me. So I just wanted to have the people here talk about some of the student work that they've encountered that claims research creation or wants to be research creation or is doing something that you think is part of the research creation oeuvre in general. And if not students, what is some other work of other people that inspires you and why? So do you want to start, Michael?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things we did is as we began to kind of rethink our history courses in the school was to think about projects that students could engage with their own research practice, their own creation practice as well. And so I teach a class called Media Art Histories, for example, where we talk about the history of art and technology as always accompanying each other. And the students undertake a project to really research the history of their own practice. Mm-hmm. So, what is the history of paintbrushes, or what is the history of pigment, or, and how are some practices that were maybe evolved a long time ago still very, very much present today, even though we think about media history as being a kind of progression of obsolete things, right? Yeah. And so I think that's been a really engaging one. So they think very actively about their own practice in that. Mm-hmm. But I've also had a number of students, and this is through the Interminus project, who really engaged with the city and urban exploration as a way of inspiring what they do, and that's been students both at the undergraduate and MFA level. Mm.
So I'm lucky that I was asked this question about a month into supervising the first student I would say is doing research creation. So we have a fairly new MFA in film and media arts. And film is not necessarily super research creation. I mean, you can argue, I think any documentary is a little bit. But one of the current students that I'm supervising is Gemma, who a lot of people in the room know. So she came out of a film undergrad, and she noticed how few films had female protagonists. And she also noticed that not only did hardly anybody make films with female protagonists. She herself had pitched and made projects without female protagonists. And it's funny because I also, when I went to film school, pitched projects with male protagonists. And she was kind of saying, what is that about? And so I think for both of us, we did it because we thought, well, you only make your film by a vote. It's very gladiatorial, like up or down. Your film is like lives or dies. Most of the people in the class are men. And for me, I wanted my film to get made, which it didn't. Apparently, I was in the top in the first round, but we did 2 rounds, which was my idea, and I didn't win in the second round. Anyways, so I thought, I want to have a male protagonist. I mean, I think, we're more the same, similar than different. But I had done the same thing. So what Gemma has decided to do, based on being super involved with all the film festivals and seeing males, like 90% of the films or more about men, she's going to make her thesis project by making a musical set in the 1950s, and she's going to film it once with a female protagonist. It's about a playwright who's trying to make it, and then once with a female protagonist. And she's working through exactly how she wants to do it, but she wants to really probe how audiences react and how they will perceive the story differently if it's a female protagonist versus a male protagonist. So I think this is a really, really interesting project. She talked to Kim about it, and she's just in the process of thinking about what's the best way to conceive it and to present it. And also not to just maybe gather data after the fact, but maybe make it this creative process when she shows it. So that's my first student doing something very research creation.
I just had a studio visit today with a student, Anushri, and he actually calls his project research creation project. So I think from now on, that's what grad students will do. And the question there was, how do you make a film that's about hybridity and third space, being other, being Indian, he's from India, and in a Canadian context? And how can you talk about that to an audience that's non-Indian, yet make it in a way that it can still work with an Indian audience? So that's pretty tricky. And he had just done a documentary and found out that that's not really what he's super interested in. So he's doing visual poetry. And so he's using poetry to figure out that in-betweenness. And at the same time, he's using film to do that. So it's kind of a combination of 2 different discourses. And we'll see where it goes. But that's the conversation we had today. And I found it quite interesting because I'm also from Banana Republic, let's call it. That's where I'm from. And so it was really interesting to think about how do you talk about a space that people cannot imagine because it's so different, or they have all these images of it. That's why I'm calling it that right now. That's kind of the image that people have. And how can you actually get beyond that and create something new.
People might want to know where you're from. She's not from the States.
Virgin Islands, yes.
That is in the States.
Yes.
It is a territory of the United States.
I don't often talk about research creation with students, except for maybe graduate students or the occasional advanced undergraduate that might be doing an independent study or something like that. But I would say that, and there are students here that have been in classes of mine, that typically with any kind of project we're doing, there's something creative aspect and there's some sort of at least reflective aspect. So that it is actually, tend to be research creation projects because there's specific learning things they're trying to do, not necessarily answering research questions in that same sense, but learning something that can be articulated in words and learning something that's articulated in sound or images. But increasingly, with more advanced students and graduate students, we're getting to reflecting a lot of the structures of research design in creative projects. So you're actually starting with an inquiry that you articulate, either research questions or objectives, or even just a topic that might be explored through just a series of experiments or sketches or whatever it is, and then contextualizing it both in terms of much more sort of creative work that's come before as opposed to the academic literature on it, but in some cases that as well, of course. thinking in terms of like a theoretical framework or an aesthetic framework, and what that might actually, how that might allow you to interpret your work in through a different lens, or through explain the way that it is or the way that it could be. And then structuring it, much more formally than I would have formerly with an advanced student, in terms of, well, go ahead and try stuff out and bring it in and I'll help you with it. But saying, okay, well, then you're going to have different phases of this, and you're going to try these different things, and you're going to evaluate them and reflect upon them. And then, of course, actually identifying creative outputs and research outputs from the project. So that kind of research design element has really come in to my teaching, and it's students, picking it up to varying extents. Some are much more excited about the creative part and get bogged down in thinking of it as a research thing, but even just bringing it to whatever they can is still interesting for me, and they still come up with surprising things, which is good.
I just wanted to add one thing. The way I think about research creation is it's about that it's using theory. So taking theory, it's funny too, because research creation is very in between and liminal, and I think sometimes on the polls of artists and researchers, they hate that. And anywhere you go, like when you're trying to mix things up, people that belong to the groups you're trying to mix often don't like that. So I find with theorists, they often are not super interested in theory being put into practice, but to me that's a huge part of research creation. So I'm going to take this philosophical theory and I'm going to interpret this artistically as a practice, and then I'm going to make it into a theory afterwards. So to me it's very much about theory, and to me that's so important for theory. So theory does its thing, and people can go down rabbit holes that are totally mind-bending, and that's important. But I also think it's really important to test them and transform them into actual real creative things.
Can you give an example of a theory that you've tried to enact in your work?
Oh
an
yeah,
evil
now
question.
I'm on the spot. A theory that I've tried to enact. I mean, I'm just really interested in philosophy of history, and so this whole notion of truth, and I mean, this is very, Twitter relevant, but this also comes from historiography and historiology and philosophies of history. But so what is truth? And when you try to probe what truth is, something happened, but it's also people's perspectives. And Bruno Latour wrote a really great essay freaking out in the George W. Bush era about what was happening to the climate, and the fact he talks about how postmodernism, this sort of, was all about tearing down ideas and taking things down and showing that there's no real truth and that kind of thing, and that he had been a part of this, and this was now being co-opted by the most craven members of the right wing that were, we weren't done with them yet, to say, and actually there's a guy, Frank Luntz, he wrote a communique to the Republicans saying, when they say that, talk about climate change, just tell them the science isn't in. And so Bruno Latour reacts to this like, I contributed to this postmodern ethos in critiquing science, and now it's being turned to like help destroy the planet. So this big clarion call. And so he says, and this is really inspiring to me, to my practice, so we have to stop doing that thing with postmodernism and tearing down, and what we have to start doing is building a consensus. So truth isn't just this like one thing that is like black and white, but things have happened. There is such a thing as truth, but how do we get at it? We have to come together. We have to discuss. So that's why I think it's so important, like what we're doing right now is like to get together and discuss. So it's not tweets flying by, and it's not everybody having their own truth, but we discuss it together. So that would be one theory that really informs my work.
Excellent. Questions? Comments? Yep. Michael?
Can research creation come out of a project that wasn't explicitly started in a research creation context?
Totally.
Absolutely.
Ziggy, go ahead.
Totally. Yeah, the interesting thing is now that it kind of like hit the headlines, it's almost like it's this new thing, but it's been around and it will be around, and it's just the way the cookie crumbles. That's how I see it. So sometimes it gets suspicious when that's your premise, when you say, okay, I am going to do a research creation project. It could get really tricky because it might be really pulled by the hair. So I tend to trust more projects where it could really see the research creation value to it, where it hasn't been explicitly said this is what it is.
Do you have an example of something that started not that way that might have morphed or might morph?
I guess like with my work, I'm playing with technologies and just having them land about and trying different things with them. Eventually, you see a weird pattern because two things were stacked or something, and so sometimes it feels like it comes out of play, and then you realize like this play fits in a theme that I'm thinking about and researching, and this might actually do something helpful here. And then I've sort of started this project or this process, but I realized like I can take this a different direction too, where I might have some research element come out of that or something.
There is, I think, some scholarly debate around whether starting without an articulated inquiry would actually qualify as research creation, but I think there's diverse views on that. There's some that would say, well, anything that has a research component and a creative component, no matter how they're ordered or how they come about, is research creation. And some that would say, well, or where that field is now or where we are now with this, that really, if you don't, that you need to be starting with an idea or starting with a question or starting with something that you're probing to qualify. I'm not a big fan of qualifying and not qualifying. If you think it's research creation, it's fine. It depends if you're looking at funding. Well, you'd have to have that. You would have to do that. But in terms of whether your work is research creation, that's up to you to decide, I think.
And you always, even if you haven't said it in a tagline or something, but you're very interested in the environment, and like you have a lot of research questions, and I think they're always there. Like I don't think you can separate the making from the thinking. Like even while you're doing things, your research questions will flow into what you're doing. So you're not suddenly going to make something that's not going in that direction.
I also think it's related to sort of different disciplinary boundaries that actually exist in institutions. So if you're getting an MFA, there are institutional requirements about what you do and you can do or you can't do. And if you're getting an MA, it's like there's different requirements and institutional boundaries. So I think it's also, I'm not going to be naive around that. There are different ways that we may be open, but my question would be also, what if you decide to go to a university and do a project, are they making you do or not do? And so, I guess my question would be like, why not just be an artist and do an MFA? Why feel like you want to do something else alongside and with? Mm-hmm. Or why feel compelled to do it? And it's not to say that one's better than the other. They're just very different kinds of practices. And so, I guess my question would be, why would you want to feel like you would want to embark on this thing called research creation? What would you get from it, and what would you also see as contributing to it? One of the things I think that's also interesting is, one of the things I'm hearing is just the different kind of creative methodologies that people are inventing here, like the idea that you were talking about, Kim, of the getting people together and experimenting with different configurations of your audience. To me, that is also part of what research creation opens up, is making us think about how we do things. And that methodology isn't like having a sausage grinder where you go, oh, here's my content and I'm just going to churn it through this and it's going to come out the end. It's being attentive to the kind of potential creativity of your own process as one that allows for a certain form of creativity and chaos, really. And I sort of hear that in what you were talking as well, Ziggy and Brent, around the kind of what it means also to come together, that challenges your own practices and your disciplinary boundaries too, that makes you do something different. But it's kind of, there's like the Beauty Project is inventing a kind of template or a format that, like a game of cards, opens up possibilities even within a kind of set of structures or parameters and boundaries. So I think also for me, research creation has been interesting for opening up, thinking about process as kind of a different way of thinking about how we even do research as work, and kind of paying attention to the methodological practices that you're actually inventing through the questions you have is super interesting to me. Jackie?
And part of too, the questioning comes with the output. What does it look like after? It's not just, for me, in thinking about research creation, yes, there's a process of crossing these disciplinary lines and entangling theory and content materiality. But there's also a point where you have to start to think, okay, well, what's it going to look like in the end? Is it, if it's not a book or an article or an exhibition, then what?
Yeah.
And so my question maybe to all of you is, how do you navigate that sort of final output component to your research creation?
Well, I have a
There
bunch.
is no final.
Yeah, exactly. I have a bunch of thoughts about that. I mean, I think from my own historical research on the history of research creation, really, and as an interdisciplinary exercise, has recognized that team building is really essential to all of this, and I think we've all seen that from our different collaborative projects. That collaborating is itself a challenge, but the team that I started researching, in the 1950s, basically put it out there that we have some ideas about technology and media that we don't understand. We need to bring people from different disciplinary backgrounds together. We need to find a common vocabulary across those backgrounds, and that's an interesting concept, I think, right? To find a shared way of talking about things. But they also said we need students to be involved. We can't do this just as researchers. We need different generational perspectives on what we're doing, right? So that's one aspect of it. And I think what also came out of that is that there isn't necessarily an outcome, right? That the process of doing that is itself the goal in some ways, right? And what we sometimes now call social practice in the art world, right, is very much process driven, and it's slow, and it's deliberative, and it's collaborative, and it requires working together and documenting that kind of work, right? And that's, I think, really important in a world that seems to be always, driven by speed and information flow that's hard to understand, right?
I've been thinking less about the product itself and more about the community, which will appreciate and participate in the same discourse that whatever we're doing is part of. So that the knowledge, the contribution could be sonic in nature, but someone that understood that and was part of that community, understood that discourse, had contributed to it, was thinking about that could actually be, in a sense, new knowledge, and in a sense, a research product, although it wouldn't traditionally be a research product. So, of course, granting councils define things in certain ways, and universities define things in certain ways. But for me, it's much more with the people that share that, how knowledge is shared among people, and making a contribution that people will appreciate and understand, and make people think in a different way, and how that works, and as opposed to this is the product for this audience necessarily.
Yeah, and for me, one thing I'm inspired by with the performance is that you're creating something ephemeral, and history, these are all history-focused things mostly, is also ephemeral. So we're trying to talk about what happened, and we're doing it, but it disappears, it's gone, and we're doing it in a space that is shared in a moment, and it disappears and it's gone. And the thing about live events, I mean, maybe if you're Justin Bieber or U2, you can have like cranes and shot, but generally live performances, you want to capture them live, and you don't want to have like a full camera at the back of the room capturing the event. So we tend not to document that way. And then I also want to write about the theory coming out of it. And of course, research creation is a theory that I apply very much to what I'm doing. And one other thing I want to hook up with what Michael was asking, there's so many ways to define research creation. I mean, I think if, like Brent said, if you want to call it research creation, go for it. If you're trying to get funding, you need to make the argument for it. But then you just shop around and you find that theorist. Like it's really often defined about what a lot of people up here are saying. It's the collaboration and the coming together. That's a very strong theoretical conception of research creation. And then also transdisciplinarity and be interdisciplinarity is another way that a lot of theorists will define it. So I'm sure you're doing it, and so it's a matter of figuring out how to explain it, and then you're good.
If I could jump in again, I think there's more than one way to look at that. The collaboration issue is something that I think that has evolved over the course of research creation. Michael alluded to that a little bit earlier, that the original programs that were created by SSHRC were to support artist researchers who were individuals working as artists in institutions, doing inquiry-driven work and recognizing that as a contribution to their discipline. And it's really latterly, in the last 10 years, especially since the shift from the separate research creation program adjudicated by artist researchers to the current insight structure, adjudicated by interdisciplinary committees of sometimes artists but always scholars, that we see much more very interesting and very rich collaborative projects. But we even see to a point where some scholars are advocating that research creation is collaborative in nature. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Stévens and Lacasse book that came out maybe in English, I think maybe a year or two ago, and in French a few years before that, which basically advocated and said that research creation is collaborative. I disagreed with that, I think, but definitely there's a lot of rich work being done that way. But in Michael's case, I don't know that. I mean, collaboration might be really interesting for you, but I think just as easily it might not be, and that you can, as an individual, still be doing something that's research creative, be an artist researcher. I like artist researchers too. You know?
Yeah, I like that too.
So I think there's something in that I'm hoping doesn't get lost as this evolves over time. The idea that artists are participating in this as individuals with or individual projects as well as the collaborative projects, which of course I've been part of multiple projects now, and they're very cool. But there's also room for, I think, individuals to do research creation too.
Oh yeah.
I guess that's why I want to have these conversations, because it's finding out what are the range of practices that are actually happening, where people want to say, this is what I contribute to this thing that is called research creation, which is an invention. So if it's an invention, then what do we want to invent? And I guess I'll skip probably question C, because I think, what time do we end?
We have like five.
C is
five
the
more minutes, 10 more minutes.
challenges. That's always
No,
good.
C is the challenge of working within the domain. Well, how about if I give you the option? Because I have two questions, but just to respect time and people's lives. So the question C was, what are the challenges of working within this domain of research creation as an artist or as a professor? And question D was, what do you see as the future of research creation, and what would you like to see? So I think I'll leave it up to you to answer either of them. Just, you can choose. And I'll start with you, Michael.
You start with me again, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think the challenge for me is really, as a professor at a university, often seeking research funding for my projects and not coming from a background where I can say I trained as a visual artist or as a musician at a university level, is making that decision. Because, I look at you write a whole grant proposal, and then your cursor hovers over am I going to click the research creation box or not?
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure if the composition of that committee is going to be favorable to what I'm proposing or not. Well, it might be safer if I say I'm a historian or I'm a communications scholar, and because I have a much better sense of what the composition of those committees are going to be that are reviewing the work, and I probably can say to them, look, this has a big creative output, but I'm not going to call it research creation. So I still find that a challenge, I think, that I have to grapple with every time.
Yeah, I think question C is easier. So I alluded to this before, but I think it's being in between and in the middle. So research creation. So in that waiting pool of research creation people, it's pretty great. Like, people are really accepting. So I think the challenge is artists looking and saying you're not an artist, and researchers looking at you and saying you're not a researcher. So I think it's just like, if we can open the bounds of that waiting pool and kind of all get along and not worry so much about your definition affecting somebody else's definition of who they are and what they're doing affecting their definition of who they are. There's hardcore artists and they're doing something very different, but it doesn't, I shouldn't threaten them, and same thing with researchers. So I think that's the challenge, and maybe that would be the future, is just to open things up and not be territorial.
So you used the word chaos a little while ago, and that's one of the challenges, because I know if I'm not open to chaos in the creative process, I'm not really researching, I'm not open to research. But do I want to open that can of worms? Because the moment I do, I have a lot of cleanup to do. So that's one of the challenges I see, and especially if I am actually collaborating, then do I want to go there? So, and within the constraints of the university, I sometimes behave, because if I if I create a lot of havoc, a lot of chaos, then there are repercussions, or there's a lot of work that comes at the tail end. So that's one challenge. And I'm glad you mentioned the word chaos, because that has me thinking right now. And the other dilemma I find myself in, as artists, we actually ask a lot of questions rather than answers, and a lot of times it's not quantifiable, and the aesthetic experience is still something that we can't really quantify and we can't measure. It's sometimes very nebulous, and sometimes we don't even know that we just had it. And then added to this is a challenge of representation we find ourselves in as artists. And what am I representing, and am I speaking about it or through it? And I'm definitely trying to do the through and not be on the meta level. So that is actually very difficult, because there haven't been like a lot of role models. And but at the same time, it's not just the challenge, it's actually why I enjoy doing it.
Brent?
I'm gonna do that. What I thought the easier question was the future, because everybody can be right. Actually, I think my personal guess, and I don't know, of course, is that the research creation will fade away as a category, something that's a type of creation or a type of research. In the same way, I think research creation is becoming more of an established methodology, thanks to the contributions of scholars like Kim, and Natalie Lovelace has just written a book, and and Kim alluded to, this is confusing with the two Kims, alluded to that, there's a considerable body of literature now, international literature in different languages, of people that have written about this. And I think, so for example, I think in universities, that the challenges of artists being accepted in universities is largely a challenge that's not a challenge anymore, that it's generally recognized that artistic work is a contribution to knowledge. I don't think that's an issue that has gone away. I think that ticking the box in the application for research creation will go away, and people writing applications to SSHRC, which is Humanities and Social Sciences, might use a methodology that involves that, and they'll describe that in their methodology as their proposals, but they won't have to tick a box, and it won't be some special thing. It'll just be like other methodologies that have become accepted over time, that were experimental and way out there 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So I think it'll fade away as something that people talk about. But I think the practice of research creation it's existed for a long time, and it will continue to exist. But I think in terms of research methodologies, it has already made its impact, and will continue to be felt that way. And interestingly, the Canada Council has reorganized their programs. We were talking about this the other night. And the main program that they have now for artists doing creative work is called Explore and Create. And there's a lot of the language around the Explore and Create program. Explore, that starts to sound like research a little bit. And describing when you're making a proposal to an arts council, you're talking in terms of what are you exploring? And as Siggy mentioned, you're exploring an issue. So in a way, it's kind of filtered in to the funding of creative projects more. The Canada Council, for example, has always been about artistic excellence, but the idea that you're actually contributing to knowledge. Innovation's always been an aspect, or originality, of artistic excellence, but I think that it's seeping in there too, and I think that will also, as those programs become more established and people think more in that way, become something that's just part of artistic practice in a way that hasn't been in the past.
I think there was a question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that or Mike, it was you that mentioned deciding whether or not to click the box, and then you were, but you had mentioned earlier about collaboration being the key between different people. So when you, and this is just a question, when you fill out a research grant, can it be interdisciplinary?
Oh, yeah.
Right. So then, I guess I'm thinking that would take away that dilemma to some extent. Like if you're, okay, this is my research arm, this is my creative piece arm, that kind of thing. And then my other question would be, when you're talking about interdisciplinary, is it generally just within the university, or would you say go with the Art Gallery of Windsor or the Historical Society of whatever place? Does it go outside?
Yeah, they would say in bureaucracy speak that's intersectoral. And so there's
That's really good.
disciplinary and intersectoral, and that's encouraged
Yeah.
quite often.
In
But
fact-
again, you have to always, if you're constructing a team, you have to then explain the role of team members so it doesn't look like you're just adding an institution as an add-on to look good. Like, who are the people who are going to be...
They don't want you padding it.
Exactly.
So it's being framed more and more around partnerships as well, right? The
Yeah.
university partnerships with other institutions, colleges, museums, galleries,
Community
medical
organizations,
facilities. Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
I was just kind of thinking, it almost seems like there's two research creations. There's the one that you just do because that's what you're doing, and then there's the one that you're using as this is how I interface with the granting system. That kind of
Yeah, you got
That's
it.
like
Yeah.
being an academic,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
There's the work that you're doing because you're doing it, and then there's the narrative you construct because they give you 8 pages and you have to describe it in 12-point font. So we all face these dilemmas, you know, but they mutate.
Yeah, that's the other thing about clicking the box on research creation is that you're already doing 18 pages to write up your grant, and if you tick that box, you have to do another page and you have to describe your methodology, which kind of sucks. I just applied for a grant and it wasn't research creation, although we're going to talk, if I get it, who knows. But research creation is a theory, but we're not doing it as research creation. I was like, yay, because I didn't have to tick that box. But and I do think so. You have to do a bit like I think with your work, you could find the research creation that describes your interdisciplinary practice. But I think that's fine. That you have to make the case to get the money seems fair. So you're absolutely right. There's definitely these two realms. One's about art and one's about money. Yeah.
to a point.
Well, they mix, and one's about getting the money to do the art to pay the students. This
Yeah.
is something Kim
Yeah.
was talking about. She's really passionate about. It's that whole. It's to get the money to do good things.
I think there
Support
is.
community partners, pay students, and do research.
Yeah, but I think there is an approach that where you're framing a project, whether you use the word research creation or not, you're framing a project in a different way because you're trying to achieve some different things that you wouldn't if you were just making a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to, for example, involving students, if you want to address, what audience do you want to participate? Is it other artists and universities, academics? Is it, a gallery audience? Is it a general public? All these things. These are things that artists would think about too, of course. But a lot of the research creation infrastructure around it, or the ideas around it, are around focusing your work around those things in a very articulating those things and restructuring it. So I think for me, that's what I find the most interesting is ways that bringing research design to creative projects can be really fruitful and also involve more people. It opens you to more collaboration, certainly involving students, different audiences too, academic audiences, not just a narrow artistic audiences. So I don't think it's quite just I'm gonna make art, but if I want to get money to do it, then or federal money from a research council, I have to do research creation. I think, and I advise people that ask about this. Sometimes working sometimes with faculty here on research creation projects and what would that look like, it's reimagining your work as inquiry and what would that entail and who could you involve and how could you make it as robust as possible from that sense. So it's a different way of thinking about your work. It's not just making work and then sort of trying to make it sound like it's research.
Yeah, and there's also different ways you build a CV too. Are you going to always think that I'm going to go to a gallery or a film festival? You're also questioning like the venues and the event nature of your work too. That's part of that research creation challenge. Like, what's the best, not just format or medium, but it's also what's the best place and location, and how am I going to share the work that I have also in a way that could be standard? Are you going to bring it to a community center? Are you going to bring it to an artist-run center? Are you going to do it as a performance that only exists online? So really asking all those questions where you don't take for granted also the kind of not just the research output, but it's like thinking about the placement of what it is you're deciding you want to share as the artifact that you're creating and inventing. And for me also, research creation really is a way of kind of acknowledging that part of, I hope, what we do in this academic world is kind of continually embracing what Isabel Stengers calls the power of invention and experimentation as a kind of something that's, important and lively and pokes us a little bit out of our kind of settledness and complacencies that I can find myself very easily getting into. Mm-hmm. So research creation for me at this point does still continue to poke that, but at some point it may just be unnecessary, fade away, and some other challenges will come up, and I think that's great.
But it is it's a word in the academic context, like we talked about, to give artists a place, because it doesn't exist in curation, does it? Or does it? In galleries? And
It's slowly...
No.
No.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be optimistic, but no.
Yeah.
We see it in education, for example, or in this, but not in the institution.
But not quite true and fair, because I'm thinking about, say, the collaboration that Leslie did with Monica King-Gagnon, around, which very much came out of Monica's research creation work, or Cheryl Sims' work although she's a curator with Phi.
Yeah, that was a weird one.
Yeah.
It's not a buzzword.
It's like it's the example that proves the.
The exception.
It's the exception that proves the rule. The project was how to fold into an exhibition of creative endeavors as opposed to didactic endeavors.
Yeah.
The research that Monica King did around Expo 67's use of innovative image technology and film, and how film evolved. Anyways, so but they commissioned art, but they didn't really commission. They asked artists to respond to certain things, and some of the recreated films were presented as well under new formats within that exhibition.
Yeah.
Around Expo 67, and the title of the exhibition was "How Shevchenko Expo was Sunset," so which was kind of a way to fold that in there as well. And the book's coming out soon, which is another academic thing. The book comes out way later than when we put the book out.
We have very many lags in my field.
It's okay. It's not a lot. It's just another ecology and another way of working and how the peer evaluation process works versus do that and
But I have a question for you, Mark, from your curatorial perspective then, in thinking of this. Could it be one of the differences within naming research creation within the museum, gallery, institution, that, at least for myself, when I first curated, the question came up, will you work with living artists or non-living artists? And it seemed to be a question I needed to have an answer for fairly quickly. And the difference in working with living artists is that it's a conversation, it is a collaboration. At least that's how I always curate. When you're working with an artist who's not living, it's an entirely different historical process. So that distinction might be really important in maybe establishing a research creation model within curatorial studies at some point.
Yeah, but there's also like a way that research material, because there's one thing that I've been kind of trying to about throughout this whole conversation, and I'll make it quick because everybody's hungry. The idea is to think about how does archival material and how does design exhibition and how does that context kind of create a new aesthetic experience that will take liberties with that material in ways that the non-living may not have approved of, but or how that affects. So the line is like really kind of slippery in terms of curatorial work within that, because you are essentially collaborating. You are essentially also multitasking in terms of the disciplinary inputs that you're accessing to make sense of the work, and so on and so forth. But it's out really kind of on a you're more of a dabbler than you would be a research creator in those terms, because you never get to go as deeply into the subjects that you would had you been in an academic context where they're multi-year and kind of more that's an decade, like something that it never ends. It always ends, the show opens and the show closes and it's not. So there are some differences, but there is some kind of cross-contamination. If you take a step back and you look at it in a more kind of macro level, you'll see a lot of connecting points, probably, sure.
Michael, do you want to respond?
I mean, part of the work I've done is very much involved with archival work and around the histories I've talked about and staging it in different ways. And so I think I agree with what you've just been saying entirely, because my archival work was invited to be part of an exhibition with my colleague Janine Marchessault, who you know worked with Monica Kim as well, and that was a show that was initiated in Europe, but we brought it here last year, called Feedback, on asking artists to respond to thinkers like Marshall McLuhan, and in terms of how do we make sense of the kind of theories that came out about media in a contemporary context. But we also staged then a lot of the archival material around where those theories came from as part of the exhibition, so that it's speaking to each other in a certain way. So I agree, it's a slippery slope, but it was really fun. It's going to be going to Montreal next, actually, to Darling. Yeah.
All right, well, it's 7:30, time to stop. Thank you very much for coming out, everyone. Thank you to our fantastic panelists.
Thank you.
And to all of you. Really great questions.
Thank you.